For more than 100 years, the most dangerous patch of ground in Britain was a thin spit of land at the mouth of Portsmouth Harbour. They called it the Point, the sailors called it Spice Island. It sat just beyond the town gate, a few cobbled lanes crammed wall to wall with taverns, brothels, gambling dens and pawn shops, and on a night when the fleet was in, it may have held the highest concentration of vice anywhere in the British Empire. Half of all the drinking houses in Portsmouth were squeezed onto this one piece of land. The law did not reach it, the press gangs hunted it. Men came ashore here after months at sea with their wages in their pockets, and were robbed, drunk, married, ruined, or carried back to a warship by morning. It was filthy, it was violent, and for the greatest naval power on earth, it was absolutely necessary. And then it vanished. It did not fall in a single night, and no bombs brought it down. What took the Point was slower and stranger than that. The wickedest few acres in Britain were quietly strangled out of existence, until the only thing left of them was a word. How does a place like that simply disappear? And why did the people who erased it save their cruelest punishment for its women? To find out, you have to begin at the gate. Old Portsmouth is one of the oldest corners of one of the oldest naval towns in the world. It grew up around the narrow mouth of a great natural harbour, on the eastern side of a channel so tight that two warships could barely pass through it abreast. On the far shore stood Gosport. On this side, guarding the entrance, stood a knot of stone defences, and behind them the town. Between the town and the open water lay the Point, reached through a single opening in the walls. It was known first as the North Gate, then rebuilt as Point Gate, and at last, after the work of 1687, renamed King James's Gate. That gate is the whole story in miniature. Everything that made the Point what it became flows from one plain fact. It lay outside. Outside the walls, outside the watch, and outside the bylaws that governed the respectable streets within. Step through the gate and you stepped out of the reach of Portsmouth's magistrates into a place that for the better part of 3 centuries made its own rules. In the beginning there was almost nothing here. The Point was a low, marshy tongue of land reaching out into the harbour mouth, valuable to the crown for one reason: it commanded the water. Whoever held this ground held the entrance to the anchorage, and so the first structures to rise on it were military, the low gun platforms and the squat stone drums that still stand today as the Round Tower and the Square Tower, built to throw iron across the channel at any enemy bold enough to try the passage. Sheltered behind the Point lay the Camber, the oldest landing place in Portsmouth, a small tidal basin where boats had been beaching their cargo since the Middle Ages. Civilian building began slowly. The first storehouses went up around 1590, plain working sheds for the goods that moved between ship and shore. But where cargo comes ashore, so do crews, and where crews come ashore, someone will always sell them drink. By 1610 there were 4 taverns recorded on the Point. By the end of that century there were far more, along with the lodging houses, the cook shops and the chandlers a sailor needed, and a good many things he merely wanted. One of them survives in name to this day. The Bridge Tavern can trace its ground back to a lease granted by the town corporation in 1656. What turned a row of storehouses into something darker was that single accident of geography. Because the Point sat beyond the gate, it was beyond the town's licensing laws. The taverns inside the walls had to close their doors at night. The taverns on the Point did not. They could pour drink around the clock every day of the week, and so the whole restless commerce of the harbour, the trade the respectable town wanted near its docks but not on its doorstep, drained out through King James's Gate, and pulled here on the wrong side of the wall where no one was watching. By the 1700s, the point had reached the height of its strange life. Out in the deep water of Spithead, the fleet rode at anchor, sometimes scores of great ships waiting for orders, for repairs, for war. When a crew was finally paid off, the men came ashore by the boatload, hundreds of them at once, carrying months and sometimes years of wages they had been given no chance to spend at sea. They came in through the harbour mouth, and many of them landed right here. What they found was a few hundred yards of bedlam. The lanes were so narrow in places that two people could not pass without turning sideways, and into that space were packed the taverns and the gin shops, the gambling rooms, the brothels, the pawnbrokers waiting to take a watch or a coat in the small hours, the slop sellers, the tailors and the cook shops feeding the crowd. By most accounts, roughly half of all the licensed drinking houses in the entire town stood on this one spit of land. We are not left to guess at the scene because someone drew it. Around 1811, the caricaturist Thomas Rowlandson made an etching he simply called Portsmouth Point, and it is one of the finest records we have of any vanished British street. In it, a one-legged fiddler saws away in the middle of the crowd, stepping over a stray dog. A naval officer leans from an upstairs window of the ship tavern, training a telescope on the anchorage to find his vessel. Sailors and the women who came to meet them spill across the quay in every attitude of farewell and reunion. Outside a moneylender's door, a woman is carried bodily through the throng. It is loud, it is crowded, and more than 200 years later, you can almost hear it. Two of the taverns from that world are still standing at the water's edge. The Still and West claims a history reaching back towards 1600 and is often called the oldest surviving pub in the city. A few steps away, the building we now know as the Spice Island Inn began as 3 separate waterfront drinking houses, smugglers' pubs by reputation, trading under names like the Coal Exchange and the Jolly Sailor. Even the area's other name is a riddle. Some say Spice Island remembers the cargoes of spice once landed at the Camber. Others say it was grim local irony, the spice of life, a wink at everything that went on here. The truth is lost, and perhaps that suits the place. What is certain is that beneath the music and the colour, the Point was a hard and frequently lethal world, thick with robbery, brawling, disease, and the fear of a fate far worse than a stolen purse. That fate was the press gang. For as long as Britain fought at sea, the Navy could never find enough willing men to crew its ships, and so it took them. Parties of sailors led by an officer would move through the lanes of the Point at night, and any man with the look of the sea about him could be seized, sometimes beaten senseless, and carried off to a warship whether he willed it or not. The hostelries that drew sailors in for pleasure drew the press gangs in after them. In Portsmouth, the practice reached its peak around 1803, at the height of the war with France, when the town corporation was so desperate for crews that it offered £100 to the first 100 men who would come forward willingly. And then, slowly, the thing that fed the Point began to die. With the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815, the great wartime fleets were no longer needed, and the press gang, never formally abolished, simply fell into disuse. The hunters left the lanes. Something larger was coming behind them, something with no malice in it at all, and it would do more damage than any gang of pressmen ever had. That something was steam. Through the middle of the 1800s, the wooden sailing ship gave way to the iron steamship, and the iron steamship was bigger, heavier, and hungry for deep water and coal. It no longer made sense to lie out at Spithead and ferry men ashore in small boats. The new vessels went straight up into the harbour proper, to the dockyard and its basins, well above the old harbour mouth. The fleet, in effect, moved house, and it left the point behind. The change was quiet, and it was total. Fewer ships at anchor in the roads meant fewer boats at the camber, and fewer boats meant fewer sailors in the lanes, and fewer sailors meant emptier taverns year upon year. In 1853, the Navy went further, introducing what it called continuous service, a proper career with steady pay, training and a pension. A man no longer signed on for a single voyage and then spent everything he had in a single spree. The whole frantic economy of the paid-off crew, the economy the Point had been built to absorb, was being dismantled from above. The customers were simply ceasing to come. For all its lawlessness, the Point had never been an accident. It had been, in its squalid way, a working part of the machine that manned the British fleet, the place where a navy run on hard usage gave its men somewhere to spend and forget, and be found again when they were needed. Take away the sailing fleet, take away the press gang, take away the paid-off spree, and the Point had no purpose left to serve. It was a service district whose service was no longer required. Then the walls came down. In the 1860s, the old gates that had fenced the Point off from the town for 300 years were taken away as obstructions, useless relics in an age of open streets. It was meant as an improvement. Its effect was to end the Point's long exile. The patch of ground that had been wicked precisely because it lay outside the law was now folded back inside it, subject at last to the same watch, the same licensing, and the same magistrates as everywhere else. The loophole that had made the place was quietly closed. These are the kinds of streets this channel exists to remember, the ones that history paved over without a backward glance. If that is something you care about, take a moment to subscribe before we go on, because the worst was still to come for the Point, and it would arrive wearing the robes of reform. Into this weakened, emptying district came the reformers, with the full weight of the British state behind them. In 1864, Parliament passed the first of the Contagious Diseases Acts, followed by harsher versions in 1866 and 1869. The stated aim was to protect sailors and soldiers from venereal disease, and Portsmouth was named among the very first towns to fall under the law. A lock hospital was provided for the purpose. What the Acts actually did was hand the police the power to declare almost any working woman a common prostitute on suspicion alone. A woman did not have to sell herself to be treated as though she had. She had only to be poor and unaccompanied and in the wrong street at the wrong hour. Once named, she could be forced to submit to an intimate medical examination, and if she was judged diseased, she could be locked away in the hospital for months at a time, by the later versions of the law for as long as 9 months, and given religious instruction to mend her ways while she was held. The men who used these same women were never examined, never registered, never detained. The law reached only one half of the trade, and it was the poorer half. This was not the cleaning of a city, it was the punishment of the people the city had used. The Point did not need to be demolished. By the time the reformers declared their work a success, the thing they claimed to be fighting was already dying of other causes, and what their machinery mostly caught was the women who had nowhere else to go. For the women caught in this net, the examination was an ordeal that one of their fiercest defenders called surgical rape. That defender was Josephine Butler, a clergyman's wife who gave up the comfort of her position to lead a national campaign against the Acts. Through the Ladies' National Association, Founded in 1869, she and thousands of women like her fought the laws in the open for 16 years, at a time when respectable women were not supposed to speak of such things at all. They won. The Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed in 1886. Many of the women dragged into the register had been no professional prostitutes. Only the wives and daughters of the dockside poor picked up on the word of a single constable, and for them there was no appeal worth the name. The stain of the register, once attached, was almost impossible to wash off, but repeal came far too late for the point. The district the law had been written to tame was by then already a shadow. The taverns had thinned, the brothels had closed or crept away to other streets. The crews no longer came. The wickedest few acres in Britain had not been stormed or burned or condemned. They had simply been emptied, quietly, over 2 generations, by progress on one side and punishment on the other, until there was almost nothing left to reform. There would be one more chapter of destruction, though it belonged to a different age and a different enemy. In the summer of 1940, the German bombers came, and for the next 4 years, Portsmouth, as one of the most important naval bases in the country, was among the most heavily bombed cities in Britain. The worst of it fell on a single winter night. A little after 6 in the evening on the 10th of January 1941, in what the city counted as its 31st raid, around 300 aircraft crossed the coast and dropped roughly 140 tons of high explosive and as many as 40,000 incendiary bombs onto the streets below. The first bombs knocked out the city's electricity, and Portsmouth went dark for 4 days. The Guildhall, the proud heart of the town, was gutted to an empty shell. In the raids of that bitter winter, the nave of the Royal Garrison Church was burned out, and its roofless ruin still stands by the sea today, kept that way on purpose as a memorial. More than 170 people were killed in that one night. Across the whole of the war, the bombing took some 930 lives in Portsmouth and destroyed more than 6,000 homes and buildings. Old Portsmouth's ancient high street, the spine of the medieval town, lost 102 of its 137 buildings. At one address on that street, a single cellar where several families had sheltered together took a direct hit, and the names of the dead, the children among them, are remembered on the spot still. And yet the fire that took so much of the old town spared the point almost entirely. The Still and West stood, the Spice Island Inn stood, the Round Tower and the Square Tower, 4 centuries old, stood as they had always stood. The bombs that gutted the respectable streets left the wickedest lanes in Britain very nearly untouched. There was no longer anything there worth the Luftwaffe's trouble. The Sin City had already been gone for the better part of 100 years. Walk out today through where King James's Gate once stood, and you will find one of the most desirable corners of Portsmouth. The lanes are cobbled and quiet. The Still and West and the Spice Island Inn, those last survivors, sell good food and cold drink to visitors who sit at the water's edge on a summer evening and watch the yachts come and go through the harbour mouth. At the Camber, a handful of fishing boats still work, and a small market still sells the morning's catch. Behind them rise the glass towers of Gunwharf Quays and the great white needle of the Spinnaker Tower, and the sleek modern building raised for an America's Cup sailing team in 2015, which stood empty within a few years of its opening. It is beautiful and it is calm, and almost nothing of what happened here is visible at all. The brothels and the gambling rooms, the press gangs and the lock hospital, the thousands of sailors and the thousands of women whose lives were spent and broken on these few acres, have left no monument and no plaque. They have left only a single word. When the men of the old fleet wrote this place into their logbooks, they shortened its name, as sailors always do, to save ink. Portsmouth Point became in their crabbed hand Pompy. And from that scrawl, so the story goes, came a nickname that outlived everything it described: Pompy. The naval base carries it, the city answers to it, the football club bears it, and its supporters still chant it from the terraces, with no notion that they are roaring the name of the most notorious sin city Britain ever built. The point is gone, only Pompeii remains.